Warning, before watching this video, make sure you have watched the first 6 episodes of the entire Passing Comparison series and all of Season 2 to get full context of what I think of all these tracks, because I will tell about those results in this video. I'll give you 10 seconds. Alright, without further ado, let's get to the season finale of the Passing Comparison series. Here it is, the season finale of the Passing Comparison series. It is a neck-to-neck battle between the fan-made American pass themes composed by King Meteor Studios and the Japanese pass themes composed by Nofumi Hateya and Masafumi Ogata. It all remains to being decided in Wacky Workbench Past. But before we go to Wacky Workbench Past, let's remember what happened all before this happened. In episode 1, the American soundtrack won in Punchy Panic Pass by a decent margin of victory. It was by over a point. In Collision Chaos, the American soundtrack made history and made its first ever win across any Collision Chaos comparison across this entire channel. In Title Tempest, the Japanese soundtrack won by an impressive margin over the US soundtrack. In Chorus Quadrant, the American soundtrack won by a landslide over the Japanese soundtrack. In Star Sway Pass, the Japanese soundtrack won by a landslide over the American soundtrack. And Metallic Madness, despite being closer than expected, the Japanese soundtrack still hung on and took the victory. And now it all remains to being decided in Wacky Workbench. Without further ado, let's get into the final round of the Past Theme Comparison series, Wacky Workbench Past, where we'll all be decided. Here we are in the final location we had yet to visit in the Passing Comparison series, Wacky Workbench in the Past Time Zone. Unlike Metallic Madness, this was a factory that was built by the people of Little Planet. It is also a smaller factory than Metallic Madness. Metallic Madness takes up more space on the world map than Wacky Workbench, which also shows that Wacky Workbench is not as technologically advanced as Eggman's technology for Metallic Madness, which would place this in the second most technologically advanced of all of the 7 rounds of Little Planet. One thing that is unique about Wacky Workbench is that it has an angelic statue in the first zone that is hidden in a secret room that will give Sonic plenty of rings. This is the third instance where you can actually see the outside in a factory-based level, and what you can see in Wacky Workbench Past is a canyon in the sunset. Very pretty on the atmosphere. Without further ado, let's get to it. Round 7, the final round. Wacky Workbench Past. Here's the Japanese version. And now for the American version. Here we are for the final comparison between the American soundtrack and the Japanese soundtrack. Let's begin. As for the strengths of the Japanese soundtrack, this track is very good at fitting that sunset of the level. It very much sounds like a factory is being built with all of those mechanical and industrial sounds in the track. I really like how the present theme is remixed in the middle of the song at the 1 minute mark. That is, in my opinion, the best part of the song. It blows away all the other parts of the song. I also think that this song has a very catchy melody. Aside from the industrial elements of the melody, I like the bass work for this. The bass work for this track. This track has a very good bass line. And I do like some of the usage of the flute. It very much fits more of that past-like scenery with the sunset. And as for the American version, this track also does a good job at fitting the scenery. This sounds like a track that could play in a sunset. It sounds like a factory that's being built too. And I like how some of the synths and pads are used to make a nostalgic feel, which definitely fits for the past timeline. And this isn't the first time KMS uses this, obviously. He used this in many other tracks, like Paul G. Panic Past and Stars Way Past. He's using it again, and it very much fits this track. I also like how he used the bits of the good feature to fit the fact that this is an industrial place. And this song is also catchy as well. I like the intro. The intro's catchy. Some parts of the bad feature where it's used is also catchy too. And of course, the good feature is obviously going to be catchy. This has very good instrumentation use. This fits the level. And I think this is catchy, just like the Japanese version. Another thing that I liked about Wacky Workbench Pass US is how the synth in this song is actually moving from left to right in your ear if you're listening to this on headphones. Very good. I actually like that. I think that's another strength that this track has as well. Now, as far as weaknesses go, the Japanese version, after the intro, for about maybe like 50 or 40 seconds, it doesn't get that interesting with this melody. As I said, some of the flute use in this track was good, but sometimes I feel like the flute was a bit weak. I feel like the flute shouldn't be doing the faster paced parts of the melody. It just doesn't sound right to me. But overall, this is a well composed track that very much does its good job at messaging. And it's catchy. And it sounds good. As for the American version of Wacky Workbench Pass, as far as weaknesses go, I feel like this track should have done a bit more with the industrial parts. The good feature of Wacky Workbench American soundtrack had a constant flowing energy of industrial mechanical parts, and this track only does so selectively, and and really only when it references the American Good Future. I feel like if this track did this a bit more, it would have been considered an overall better fit in terms of the factory aspects of this track than the Japanese version. I also feel like after the intro, some parts just gets a little bit uninteresting, just like how the Japanese version does. And unlike the Japanese version, there isn't really that much of a defined part where the song is very, very good, aside from the parts that reference the good future and the bad future. But overall, this is a track that fits the scenery, it fits the level, it's catchy, and it sounds good, just like the Japanese version. As for deciding the winner for this track, it's going to be very, very hard. It's going to come down to a lot of factors. It's going to come down to which track is a better fit, which one is catchier, and when it comes to the melody, it's going to come down to which version of Wacky Workbench was remixed better than the other version, and by how much. So it all adds up very well, and it can give a good result, a clear result of who wins this round. When it comes to fitting the level, I think both versions of this track fit the background art for this level. The US version fits that sunset in the background, and the Japanese version fits the canyons a bit better. And when it comes to the actual parts of the stage that are industrial, mechanical, and the factory being built, I think they both do a good job equal in their own ways. When it comes to the gameplay of this level, however, I think the Japanese version fits a bit more when it comes to that bounciness in the track, in the bass line, which very much fits Wacky Workbench as it is known for its bouncy floors. And my favorite part of both melodies was when my favorite version of the track was remixed. When it came to the Japanese version of Wacky Workbench Pass, I loved it a whole lot when the present theme was referenced. It's a very good melody, and I'm glad that it was used again in this track, and for quite a long interval of time. Whereas the American version, I like how it referenced the good future in this track to make the level fit the more industrial parts of the track better. However, I will note that the lack of energy from the industrial and mechanical parts that was in the US Good Future not being present in this track does hinder it a bit. But I will still not deny that when it was referenced in the track, I very much liked it. This was a close round, but I feel like there is a slight winner. And the winner of the Sonic CD Passing Comparison Series is... From Sonic City YouTuber and remixer King Meteor Studios, the American soundtrack will be the winner of the Sonic CD Passing Comparison Series on this channel. This was a very close one, but I think the American soundtrack is the better track slightly, because alongside its remixes of the American Good Future, its callbacks to the present and bad future were also good. Whereas the Japanese version, it only had a very good callback to the present theme. And it was a very, very good callback at that, but it didn't do much callbacks to the bad future or good future that could really compare much to the present theme's quality. And that does make the track trail a bit behind the US soundtrack. So effectively, the American soundtrack won this entire season because KMS included the US Good Future theme and Wacky Workbench Pass. And not only did he include it, but he remixed it well. He wove it into the track very well. And that is what handed the US soundtrack its narrow, razor-thin victory in this track. And it has overall won the Passing Comparison Series on this channel. Let's get back to the world map for the final time.
future.
There it is, the final score. Out of the 7 available rounds, the American soundtrack has won a majority of them by a 4-3 margin over the Japanese soundtrack. It all came down to a slight difference, a slight razor-thin difference at that, in Wacky Workbench Pass, but the American soundtrack has narrowly done it. It has narrowly beat the Japanese soundtrack, and it will be the victor of the passing comparison series on this channel. I hope you guys have enjoyed this series, but before you go, I want to give a good thanks and shout out to KMS for making the American Pass themes, even though he didn't have to. I'd also like to give a huge shout out to the Japanese soundtrack's composers for the passing comparison series. Post commentary here, but I also want to give a shout out to Spencer Nilsson and Mark Crew for making a majority of the US soundtrack, particularly the level themes. I think what they could have made for the US Pass themes would have been very great if they weren't technologically limited due to the way how they were coded in for the Japanese soundtrack. I also want to give a shout out to you, the viewer, for watching the comparison series all the way through to the end. This series also would not have been possible without you. And a big shout out to God for creating all the people who are involved in this, and also a big shout out to him for dying for our sin. Even though the Japanese soundtrack didn't win overall in the passing comparison series, I think the Japanese pass themes were obviously very good. And I thank both of these composers for trying their hardest on making these 7 tracks. And most of the tracks that have appeared in passing comparison series are good tracks in my opinion. I don't think there's a single one that's actually disliked by me. I also want to say one more thing too before leaving. The American Pass themes were extended by one of my friends a year ago. I've had these extensions on my computer for over a year now, and I'm going to share them publicly soon after this series drops. And they will be added to the playlist, the Sonic CD Extended Archives playlist. So a huge shout out to my friend for extending those tracks for me to put on the channel. I won't say his name because I don't think he wants his name to be said in this video, but huge shout out to you. But with that, it is time for me to depart from this series and say thank you for watching all the 7 parts if you had the time to do so. I have worked so hard on these 7 parts of the passing comparison series, and I am so glad you guys have stayed here throughout all of this. I knew that this was some highly requested content that you guys wanted to see after Season 2, and I thought about doing this a year ago, and I've been planning ahead of doing this sometime this year, and it's all gonna end. But just another thank you, again, a lot of thanks for this, but I will see you guys in the next video, which I have an idea what that next video is gonna be. But until then, good night if you're watching this at night, God bless you, regardless of what time of day you're watching this in. And I will see you guys in the next video. Farewell!